Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Supply Chain Talk. Great that you can join us today. My name is Duncan Brock. I'm a director at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and I've got the pleasure of hosting today's discussions. Those of you who've joined us before will know that we run this in a very lively format. We want to really encourage people to join in and discuss with us. So as you're joining us, please do put something in the chat, tell us where you're from. And hopefully, as we go forward, we'll get some good chat and some questions from you. So last week, we focused on being a good supply chain leader. We had a great panel, and we were talking about different aspects of leadership. Today, we're going to drop down into a really more specific focus on sustainability, but really looking at how you can really support suppliers to focus on net zero and sustainability, and the challenges of really doing that down through the supply chain. So really looking forward to that discussion. We've got a couple of great guests who are coming in with some real expertise, some real passion about how to drive this topic forward. So really looking forward to that discussion with them today. Welcome to, I think, Mark, I've just seen you joined us again. So welcome to you. Welcome back to you, Trudy. I see someone also saw me in the QE2 Centre earlier today. Welcome to you, Namdi. I think I was at a proper conference a bit earlier today. We had a discussion around challenges of being in supply chain, leading supply chains forward, and I had the pleasure of being on a panel discussion both on that topic, but also talking about sustainability. So it was quite nice to balance a face-to-face conference with also being here in today's Supply Chain Talk. So welcome to you, Namdi. Good to see you again. Please do get involved as you are already. Chat, any Q&A, any good questions you've got for our two guests, please do pop them up there, and I'll make sure I bring those into today's discussion. And we have a little incentive for those of you who haven't seen it before. We have this really fantastic high-quality Supply Chain Talk mug, which I give out one at the end to the person who's really maybe added the best comment or chat or asked the best question, which has really stimulated the discussion and the debate for us. So please do enter, please do get involved, and really look forward to this session. So a couple of guests. I'm going to bring the first one in now. Alexandra Hammond, if you could join us. Alexandra is the head of Sustainable Procurement and Supply Chain at NHS England and NHS Improvement. So Alexandra, welcome to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Duncan. Great to be here.
Yeah, and I think you've also been to a live conference today, and I think you just said you just managed to get into a hotel room and check in. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for joining us on time. That's great.
Yeah, it's been great. I'm actually in Liverpool. I have a beautiful view of docks, which is great. And yeah, speaking about net zero and supply chains to food suppliers, actually, at the Hospital Caterers Association. So busy day, but really exciting to be part of this discussion.
That's good, thank you. And maybe just a little bit about yourself, Alexandra. So what is your role at NHS?
I'm head of Sustainable Procurement and Supply Chain at NHS England, NHS Improvement, the national body for the National Health Service. And that covers a lot of things, but essentially what my role is tasked with doing is decarbonizing the supply chain of the NHS. So about 62% of the carbon footprint of the NHS sits within our supply chain, so our suppliers and our suppliers. So I'm tasked with that slightly formidable challenge, but it means that I get to spend a lot of time having conversations with suppliers and people who make purchasing decisions about how we can begin to really incorporate that into the way we make decisions.
That's great, thank you. Thanks, Alexandra. Thanks for joining us. The first part of Supply Chain Talk, we pick up an article that hopefully stimulates a discussion a bit more about the broader topic, and then a bit later we'll get into the more specific focus on the suppliers. But there's an article that was sort of came out last month, and it was an article about supply chain sustainability and net zero challenges. And this was a research team from Harper Adams University who were looking at this for HSBC. And I think when you look at this article, I think they really focused on a couple of case studies. One was with Belton Farm, which is a cheese producer in Shropshire, and the other one was a fresh food producer, Bakkavor. But I think they use those two case studies to really say, okay, so what are the challenges associated with supply chain sustainability? And a few things came through to me as I read through this. One is communication. What they said was effective communication to your suppliers, to your supply chain, letting them know what's coming, what they want, what you want from them, and so on. But also communication the other way, listening to the customers, communicating to customers. So I think the communication came through quite strongly. I think it's also maybe going to come back to you, Alexandra, in a minute, but complex supply chains. I mean, the supply chains we all deal with are very complex, and working your way through that and focusing on that, and I'm sure we'll pick that one up as well. But they also touched on technology and the fact that technology can bring huge benefits, both short and long term, but it's going to take some real time to maybe invest in the right technologies to pull that forward in the right way. So I think really interesting, some really good research and insights there, but probably nothing we didn't know, but actually using a couple of case studies to bring it to life. But I mean, Alexandra, I'd be interested in, I suppose, based on where you started from, your experience of that sort of challenge and whether those key elements resonate with you.
I mean, communication, 100%. So one of the challenges that we've often had with supply chain work in any way, not necessarily specific to net zero, is having one-way conversations with our suppliers. So telling them what to do, but not listening to what they're already doing. But also our suppliers telling us, giving us what they think we want, but we don't necessarily tell them what we want. We're not necessarily driving the right kinds of behaviors from our supply chain. So the elements of communication in that article really resonated with me, because we as the NHS have been really focusing on this in the last year. I took up this role in April last year, so a year ago. And the first thing that really was that my main priority was really signaling to suppliers what we wanted from them, participating in that conversation with suppliers early on. So between now and the end of the decade, we want suppliers to do a number of different things. We have a supplier roadmap that we've had approved by our board that then sets out specific dates and really is clear about the milestones for contracting with the NHS. And that's really our really a key part of how we've planned to be effectively liaising with our supply chain on this. I think what's interesting as well is what I really liked was the conversation about technology, which is changing more rapidly than we've ever experienced in our lifetimes. Technology has the power to really shift the way that we buy, the way that we the products and services that we need in the first place, the way that we work with our patients, with our customers, in other supply chains, and I think that rapid change really needs to be reflected in the conversations we're having with suppliers to be able to make sure we take advantage of the opportunities there, because there are definitely some risks as well. So lots in that article, I think, to talk about.
Yeah, and I think I've just seen a couple of comments in from John Henderson, which I'll maybe sort of build on two of those, because one of his comments was around the fact that you need to improve communication and collaboration skills. I think back to the point you just made there, often you can transmit, but you don't actually never know if people have really got that message, or you're not listening to feedback on it, which I think is a good point. I think he also says that you need to combine technology and human behavior to be able to deliver that change. I think that sort of resonates with exactly what you said there. It is all those aspects.
John.
Yeah, but in a way, it's quite challenging because, I mean, just effectively, you've got a vast supplier base across the NHS. How do you communicate effectively so they all both get the message, but also give a chance to feedback? Because you've probably got one of the biggest supply chains in the UK, haven't you?
Yeah, and having been at this conference earlier today, I'm speaking with suppliers, and they're saying, we want to talk to you, we want to work with you, we want to, and with the best will in the world, we can't have conversations with every single supplier. We have between 80 and 100,000 suppliers within the NHS. So, our team just does not have the resource to have that conversation with every single supplier. But what we do need to do, that's why our guiding principles are so important, to get those out, but then also to have ways of communication back from the supply chain. So our team holds a supplier forum every other month, and we use that forum as a way of communicating out, but also getting feedback from our suppliers. We don't invite 100,000 suppliers to that forum. We invite the trade bodies that represent those suppliers. So they are a really important conduit and an advocate for their members to us, as well as, a really important part of our kind of development, because we need to understand what it is that their members are feeling, and they do a big part of the legwork for that for us.
Right, and I think that's, you're coming there about suppliers saying, well, who do I talk to? I've been trying to talk to somebody and I just don't know who to share this with, and who's the right person who will lift it up and take it forward. And maybe that's a topic we'll come back to, because I think engaging suppliers in the right way there is key. I think your point about trade bodies is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because some of them are very effective, but some of them, we deal with some, and you don't necessarily see that they're as proactive as you'd like them to be. So while they're representing their members or their suppliers, are they really doing a good job on your behalf of communicating that effectively down through to their members in a way that's landing with them and is resonating and advocating? And because you've got a middleman already then, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's by nature a less than efficient process than we would like, because we want to be able to have those conversations directly. But I think it shows the value of a really good trade body, because they can really be an advocate for their members, and actually we're quite fortunate in that many of ours are quite they're very proactive with us, which is great. But I do think the other thing is just getting out there. I mean, I know with COVID, it's really hard to do that, and you have to do it sort of virtually. But it's having it's being able to say, we're here. This is on our website. I know websites are a bit passé these days, but this is our roadmap. Here it is. This is what we expect. By 2023, we need your scope 1 and 2 emissions. Give us, let's have those conversations now, so that by 2023, that's no big deal. And John's right. We can't assume that they're hearing us. We have to keep having that conversation, keep putting that conversation out there. And so trade bodies are one conduit and an avenue. But we use a lot of social media. We use the press. I mean, there's a lot of things that we are really keen to make sure that we're saying. But keeping the messages relatively simple, so when they're heard clearly, is also really, really pivotal in terms of getting that conversation established.
Yeah, clarity of message and clarity of requirements coming through, which is really strong. Let me bring in our second guest. So Hayley Gauntlet is going to join us. She's a director at QBL Consulting. So Hayley, if you could come and join us, that would be great. We'll just wait, hopefully, for her to get the camera and the microphone on. So good to see you, Hayley. So I sort of gave a very broad sort of, here's your job title, Director at QBL Consulting, but maybe describe a bit more about who you are and what you do. And you do need to turn your microphone on. And I know, I'm not going to say you're on mute, because that I hate it, but thank you for turning your microphone on as well.
You'd think I'd never done this before. But basically, yeah, so I'm a consultant, and I work with FTSE 100 companies, mostly, to help them sort of like navigate through the issues around sort of like modern slavery specifically, but also, from a broader human rights perspective. So when we're talking about sustainability, I'm on the social side of sustainability. And working in these areas, especially when, and I completely agree with what Alexandra was saying in terms of about communication and collaboration. My experience is that people just do not communicate enough to their supply chain about what they want. And I think that we're, in terms of the supply chains that I am now sort of like used to, that I've been doing this for more than 20 years, sort of like helping people in their supply chains around labour rights and human rights standards. The more forward-thinking organisations are basically setting their sort of like supply chain up to take a lot more ownership as well, rather than just about that one-way communication of this is what we expect you to do. It's actually, we expect you to own this agenda. It's not us just saying, that's absolutely what you need to do.
So to follow that through, so I suppose you can say that message, and you can say I want you to own it, but I mean, I suppose the challenge is: do suppliers own it? Do they really feel that they have that sort of compelling need to change? Because I mean, I can see, if you're part of the government set up, there's a big drive to forward. If you've got investors pushing you to do things, you'll drive forward. But if the customer's asking you, do you really need to do it, or is that sort of seen as a big cost and a bit of effort? I'm not sure if I really want to yet.
I think, like I say, I mean, I do a lot of my sort of like business originally was in the food industry, so basically with retailers, and I do still work with retailers, quite a few of them. But I also work along in energy, construction, various different areas now. But I think that the retailers were quite a bit further forward in some of the initiatives. Initially around procurement of responsible sourcing, because they were being pushed by consumers and by investors, and absolutely there was a lot of dragging people to the table. But I do think this study highlights two, actually, that the article looks at two such businesses in the food industry, and one of them I know very, very well. And they are part of a supplier initiative that is actually originally was like proposed by the retailers, but this is now owned and driven by the supply chain. It's not the retailers, doesn't belong to the retailers. It's basically them calling themselves to account. So I think, and that was set up in 2015. And it's basically an initiative called FNet, and I don't know if anyone else has heard of it, but it is purely the suppliers saying, we have to own this agenda as well. So I think you can, does it go all the way through the supply chain at the moment? No, because it's not old enough to be able to do that. But I do think that where you can, where you're a little bit more matured in those relationships, the key thing around FNet is this communication and collaboration. Absolutely, because it's all the peer groups working together. They may be in competition with each other, but they've really understood that they can't be in competition with each other to be able to address some of these key issues.
And I think collaboration is challenging to do, but actually I think whenever I talk to people on this, they say, as you say, I can't do it myself, but actually if collectively we get together and start to really drive this change through, we will be heard. And we'll get some of the improvements we want to make, but quite challenging. What's your view on the use of technology in this space, Kaylee? Because that was the other sort of element that came through in this sort of article about, it's starting to make some impact. There's some short and long-term benefits, but even there, it takes time to implement, invest, and then start to get the benefits from it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I can't talk about the environmental sustainability part of it. I know some things that happen for technology on that, but I know that from a social sustainability perspective, there is an investment in technology at the moment, especially around things like worker voice, a way of accessing workers that actually cuts out sometimes the requirement, or not cuts it out, it basically changes the dialogue between a company and the workers in that supply chain. So for example, rather than having audits where you get an auditor who goes out and interviews people, what you actually do is you make technology available through mobiles and through apps to actually take in that worker voice from a certain community. And that's doing a lot to actually strengthen worker voice in communities, especially hard to reach communities. For example, on fishing vessels, where it's very difficult to actually help support workers on fishing vessels, and ensure that there's no issues around sort of like inhumane treatment and things like that. So actually allowing this ability for them to be able to communicate via technology rather than have to be next to somebody face to face is a real bonus. And I know that that's actually really helped people. So I do see that there's a way forward. I mean, I do know of some environmental work that's being done around, deforestation in Brazil and sort of like, and sort of like using satellite mapping and things like that. And so that can only be a good thing. Also, the sort of like, again, sticking with fishing, but it's actually trying to use technology to stop the unregulated and illegal fishing practices. So without technology, it's a very, very difficult thing to actually be able to do. So I do think technology is really important going forward, but I do also think you need that human interaction as well as that, because you can't do it all with technology. And especially from a social perspective, people like to speak to people. It's one of those things.
Yeah, and you can influence far better by communicating effectively with people. I think that we described there as technology being a bit of an enabler. So if you're looking for information, you're looking for clarity of what's going on, that visibility, that's where maybe technology can play a stronger part for us all. Alexandra, I know you touched on it initially, but I mean, I think we just lost Alexandra. She's just sort of moving around. I'll wait for her to come back in. I've just seen sort of a post on the chat as well about, if you've got any questions for Hayley and Alexandra, please do add them. We'll come back to that as we go forward. So maybe we can drop into the more specific discussions around on this topic, which we wanted to cover about how to really support suppliers, because we talked about communicating with them. We talked about that sort of two-way flow of information. But one of the challenges I think that we all have in the suppliers is that when you're really saying to them, we need you to change, are they really being as transparent as they should be, and as focused, and therefore sharing the information they need to be about their supply chains and what their supply chains look like? And I'd be interested, Hayley, in your thoughts on that, because you can talk to the converted almost and get them, absolutely, but when you start to get to those suppliers who avoid the issue, don't really want to talk about what's going on or what they're doing, what needs to change there to really get those suppliers on board and understanding and then implementing some of the things they need to implement?
I think that with that, you need to sort of like engage with them to explain and allow them to understand the benefits for them as a business. Because if you think about, environmental is much further forward than social sustainability. And the reason that happened initially, because I used to look at environmental as well, I used to look at environmental and social, and I moved much more to the social side because it's an area that I felt more drawn to. But when we look at why people originally moved to environmental reporting and improvement, was because there was a benefit in it for them. They could actually save money by saving power. They could actually, by using less fuel, by using using less polluting substances in sort of like in agriculture, it is actually saving them money. So I think that there was a real benefit to them. But it's trying to explain those benefits for them and basically ensure that there is a benefit in it for them. That isn't just penalising the supply chain, because if you're going to, it has to be a win-win between you and your supply chain. You can't force these things down and just expect them to take the hit, because supply chains aren't robust enough to be able to do that. There isn't enough margin, especially in food supply chains. And I know I talk about food, but that tends to be the area that's very, very tight on margins, and obviously, very much involved in sort of like from a sustainability perspective, absolutely, called to account on those aspects. So I think, that it's basically making sure that we do build build some robustness into the supply chains, and it's not just. I noticed that I think there was a comment about the retailers having the power, and it needs to be more of a partnership than a power play, because it's never going to work like that. And I think now more than any other time before, and I've been in retail for a very long time, there is a much better power balance than there ever was. There's very difficult things that that happen within supply chains, but ultimately, it's consumers that drive a lot of change. And if consumers and investors are the people driving this, and we can actually make it worthwhile for people in our supply chain to understand that, this is a benefit to you. There are so many benefits you can have from sustainability, both, I think I've mentioned this last time, but Robert G. Eccles has done a lot of studies on how being a more sustainable business makes you a more profitable and a more stable and long-term business. So it's absolutely incredulous that people won't even look at that and say, well, it's going to cost me. Well, actually, no, the evidence shows that it's going to make you money.
Yeah. I think. Welcome back, Alexandra. I saw your sort of Wi-Fi problems in your hotel room. It's the joys of traveling again, eh? You can actually sort of get that through. But I think that sort of aspect of collaboration, I think the point you made, Hayley, is sort of two-way communication is there. But is there also a piece about educating suppliers, helping them to understand, as you described there, so what the benefits are and why they should do this? Because sometimes they'll hear well, I need to, but actually, do they fully understand the benefits to their organisation and their business if they make the changes? I mean, Alexandra, interested in your comments there.
So it is a really important dynamic, right? That this is an issue that is affecting all of us, and corporations and big organizations like the NHS are making net zero targets and asking their suppliers to get on this journey with them. And some suppliers, mostly those who see a commercial driver and benefit for themselves, are on this journey already, and they can where there's a really clear business case for them to do it. Some aren't, and some are struggling to just stay afloat, and that's really really something we need to keep in mind when we ask tough things of suppliers. However, this is a problem this is the problem of our time. This is the challenge, and we, right before I got cut off, and apologies for that, but we were talking about collaboration, and climate change is a problem that needs collaboration. No single person is going to solve it, and that is going to mean that we need to rely on our passion to a certain extent, and our will and our commitment, but we also need to create a vision of a better future together, and that's a more profitable future, that's a more sustainable future, that is a future where we take care of nature, and we put in good processes, and sort of in terms of our with food, in terms of our soil and agriculture going forward. And I think there's that conversation you can have that is the sort of the positive, let's do this together, we're all we're all one humanity. And then there's also the part that we've introduced as well, which is that if you don't do it, then we're not going to work with you.
Right.
And that's kind of, it's like, yes, we're going to give you some time, and yes, we're going to make it as collaborative, and we're going to support you. But if you don't do it, sorry, but you're not going to work with the NHS after a certain date. Yeah. And that's why we need to be so clear about our expectations, give suppliers the best chance of success, raise the overall level of expectation and performance of our supply chain overall. And for those that say that they're not getting involved, they're not going to do it, well, then they'll have to find other people to sell to.
Yeah. And I think just on that thing of, you said there's a bit of a threat there at the end, which is a business threat almost, so you can lose this lucrative contract as you go forward. But actually, I think there's a few questions coming in here, and I think Eshwal, welcome back to you. Thanks. Eshwal is great. He always puts loads of questions up here whenever we run Supply Chain Talk, which is brilliant. But I think he's raised a few things there which maybe build on that. One is about I suppose pre-qualifying suppliers. What requirements do you put there? I think the second point is then put about how do you then measure performance. So as you're saying, hold you to account, but actually what is the real measures that you would put onto a supplier? Because ultimately, if you want to get rid of them, they need to be able to demonstrate what those real KPIs and those performance measures are. So I'd be interested in both your comments on that in terms of both the requirements up front, but also then how would you then go about really measuring performance in the right way?
I'll respond to that just first quickly, because I wanted to say, no, we don't want to not work with any suppliers, but we just want to be clear that we mean what we're saying, and it has impacts if people don't engage. And so Duncan, that point is so important. How do you measure it? Because you have to create an equal playing field. You can't tell people you're not going to work with them if you don't make it clear what you expect of them and then give them a way of telling you how they're doing it. Otherwise, it all falls apart. So, in our case, we've created we have a supplier roadmap, where we also are creating an assessment framework for suppliers to tell us what they're doing. So the minimum expectation from, great, that'll be reflected through that, but it's also a way for suppliers to tell us what they're doing extra on top of what we're asking as a minimum expectation. And that, I think, is really, really important, because we have a clear structure and language of communication between us and our supply chain to make sure that we're providing that structure. So if they don't engage with those clear parameters that we set out, then we can clearly document that and say, this is why we're not going to be working with you. But equally, we have the chance in the meantime to say, this is actually not that difficult. We're not trying to make really big barriers for you. We're trying to improve the viability of your future business as well. And this is how we want to engage with you.
And I think exactly the same as Alexandra, really, because we have, in terms of qualification, of supply chain and suppliers, there are lots of systems and processes in place to actually pre-qualify supply chain before you actually bring them on. So that, through a variety of different checks, and that could be through, through financial audit, it could be via ethical audit, or, environmental aspects. A lot of suppliers have to provide a lot of data up front, actually, to bring them on. And I think then once you've pre-qualified your supplier and brought them on board, you set the parameters exactly like Alexandra was saying. You've got these parameters that they need to meet those requirements. But beyond that is exactly what she was saying about the fact that there's also, they can show you what extra they're doing. And lots of businesses that I work with do more. Backavall, who were mentioned in the actual supply chain in that article, they're very much up and center forward. They've got a very good program in place that is probably more than meeting the standards required by their customers, and actually exceeding it in certain places. So they're actually showing this level of transparency and actual proactivity in this space, rather than just sitting back and saying, okay, I'm just going to meet these few parameters you put in place. So I do think there are ways to record it, and all of this data can be recorded in various different places, in databases, areas people might know of, places like SEDEX, for example, which is the Supplier Ethical Data Exchange. And this can be viewed and quantified, and we can see where the issues are, and where the issues appear, we can actually work with them to actually address those issues. So all of this is done in an upfront and open and honest manner. So I think that there are ways that you can actually make sure that your suppliers are performing to your requirements.
And I think that point about data, Hayley, is a really important one, though, isn't it? Because there are lots of data sources. And I spoke to two people this morning who were both touting their wares in terms of their ability to be able to sort of measure and track and report on performance, but they're there. Now, sometimes the metrics they use are different. Sometimes the lens they look through is slightly different, but fundamentally there are data sources. And I think often we can all get very, I suppose, analytical. Is it a perfect data set? Is it a perfect measurement or not? But actually there's data there. And if we've got good data and we've got a good starting point, then at least we can start to see how things are improving.
I think probably, and it's a bit remiss of me actually, when we talked about technology, one of the biggest leaps forward at the moment in technology is the availability of these new data sets and the new way of gathering information. And I should have mentioned it earlier, but it's kind of like, there's a lot, like you say, there's lots of people touting their wares at the moment. I constantly get contacted by people who have all sorts of fantastic whizzy technology because they want to access my clients via me and sort of like with this new technology, which is great because some of my clients do need this. They haven't necessarily got this in place. So I do see that the future will be, the very old clunky school way that I was brought up through this industry is changing to a much slicker and more effective way of harvesting data.
Go on, Alexandra, you're going to come in there.
Sorry, I'm trying to come off mute. So data is a really interesting one for us because traditionally we haven't had great data. And that's not an NHS problem. That's generally a supply chain problem. I think a lot of time people working in complex supply chains feel they don't really have that clear a picture of the complexities of what they buy. We are asking in 2028, we're asking our suppliers to give us the environmental impact of their products and their services. And this is really challenging. Scope 1 and 2 emissions targets, pretty easy in the grand scheme of things in terms of, it's your direct emissions. It's things you tend to have bills for, so you can sort of see that quite clearly. But from April 28, we'll be asking suppliers to give us for, the impact of the stuff they give us and they sell us and the services. And that really relies on good data and good methodologies for measurement. And, we have some time between now and then to really clarify what that is for suppliers, because we can't have everybody measuring in different ways. And so that's a big part of our program over the next year or two. But also, we'll just get nowhere if we want perfect data. We just will, our carbon footprint, right? So 16,500 kilotons of carbon sit in our supply chain, according to the net zero report from 2020. Is that 100% correct? I mean, almost undoubtedly, no. We know that it's not perfect, but we know that we have to start somewhere. And that's being a bit brave with data, I think, is really, really an important principle. And sometimes it's 80-20, and sometimes it's 60-40. And as long as it's something that gives you a direction and a clear way forward, you can improve the data over time. But, particularly in the area of net zero, we just have to get going on this agenda. We can't wait around for perfect data. We have to be able to say, okay, look, these are the things we know are big impacts. Let's see what we can do to address those right away.
Yeah, I remember being in discussion with someone recently and they said, oh, it's not net zero anymore, it's sub-zero. And it's one of those sort of conversations you looked at and went, really? It's like, does it really matter how you describe one or the other? It's still, you've got 16,000 tons of carbon in your supply chain. That's a lot to get rid of, right? So it's let's not keep raising the bar when we've still got a huge amount to go to actually.
Yeah, any kind of zero would be great, right? I mean, there's a lot of nuance in the kind, is it real zero? Is it natural zero? There's all sorts of ways we can talk about this and frame it, but the truth is we need to get going on the journey, and climate change is happening. We're seeing it, we're feeling it. And those of us with influence in our wide supply chains have a real responsibility to put our money where our mouth is and really, work with our suppliers to say, hey, we're not doing this because we want a good CSR strategy approval from our patients. We're doing this because it matters and it affects health. And that, we are here as a health service. And that, I think, is, another really important message to keep going on, which is that, without a healthy environment, we will not have healthy people. And so, if a supplier says to us, why is this important? Why, I've got all sorts of other things to worry about. Well, so do we all, but this is really fundamental and it needs to be a big priority.
Yeah. And I think, there's a couple of comments in here or questions in from Ashley Cook, and I think welcome back to you, Ashley, as well. But I think it's one around that sort of, I think just to build on what you said there, Alexandra, this, you have a responsibility for this. He calls it the ecosystem, but basically, you're in a position of power, you're in a position of influence across the supply chain, getting that supply chain working well and being healthy and driving forward the right initiatives. You've got a big position of influence, and therefore using that effectively is a key part of what you can bring. And I suppose, Hayley, the organisation you work with, I assume a lot of those are in the same position where, taking that responsibility for that broader ecosystem and making it work effectively and drive forward on the right initiatives, of which clearly, net zero or low emissions or whatever phrase you want to use, that's a critical part that most organisations have to take full ownership for, don't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, the majority of people I work with absolutely understand that. They, given the size of the businesses and the work that they're doing within their sort of like supply chains, and that they do grasp that, and they understand, that it is their responsibility to address that. I think that the difficulty is that this is a really big understatement, but it's not very easy. It's kind of like it's a difficult thing to do, but it doesn't excuse it. They are still responsible for it, and they know they're still responsible for it. It's just they're kind of like trying to do the right things, and I do think that there is a real will. If I look back 15 years, I just don't think there was a real will at the time, and people didn't understand how important it was. But I do think now there's a real will to actually move forward. I've seen investment in this, especially in the environmental aspect, go up ridiculously, so that we're lots of people are investing in obviously renewables and making sure that most of their electricity, some of my clients, most of their electricity will come from renewables. In fact, one of them has actually already met their target in 5 years earlier. They had the target for 2025. They actually met it in 2020 in terms of being carbon neutral on their sort of like energy. So yes, they are taking it seriously.
And I think it's great that shift is happening, that it's not a kind of a niche set of people who kind of see themselves as green, who are caring about these issues. For me, the step change is how you start to look at what we would call scope 3 emissions, the emissions of your suppliers and their suppliers, and how you start to really influence and address those. Because for some of our suppliers, the NHS, as I mentioned before, 62% of our emissions sit in our supply chain. But for some of our suppliers, 92% of their supply chain, of their emissions sit in their supply chain. Their direct emissions are quite small compared to the production and manufacture of the products or services they sell. So it's fantastic to see the change, but we can't be complacent. I think we must, particularly those of us who work in supply chain, we have to be ambitious in our scope, and not just say scope 1 and 2, your electricity use and the vehicles you own. That's important, but it's really, really step 1 of maybe 50, 100 steps, and we don't want to intimidate people out of the conversation, but we also want to say to them, this is going to need accelerated change and energy, and it's really important that the conversations are happening that say, okay, well, fantastic, you moved to renewables, what next?
Yeah.
And that's really the kinds of conversations I think we should be having with our networks.
Yeah, and I think it's also examples of where people have done it well to learn from them as well, isn't it? So how did you do that? What was the step you took? What was the improvements you made? And at the moment, there's, I think back to your point, Hayley, there's a lot of people now wanting to do this and making some small steps. There are some organizations that have been doing it for a long, long time and have really got some great sort of case studies, examples, and maybe we're all going to do a bit of a better job of bringing some of those to life as to how they did it, what the impact was. But as you said, Alexandra, what their next step is, because they haven't just got there and went, oh, thank goodness for that. It's they're now into looking at that supply chain, looking at reducing the level of, I don't know, whether it's freight and logistics or improving how things are done, or where the sort of core commodities come from in the first place. There's a huge amount that they can still do to take that forward, rather than just thinking, well, I've got there, I'll go on to my next project. So, Hayley, I've got a specific for you that came from James King. It said, Hayley mentioned ESLER. What's the abbreviation? ESLER, SLR, or what is it?
I don't remember saying any of those, if I'm honest. So I haven't a clue what ESLER is.
I think you're talking about some sort of retail, or there's some sort of initiative you were talking about.
Yeah, that's FNET. But FNET is the Food Network for Ethical Trade. So that's what it's short for. There's a website for it if you wanted to go and have a look at it, and it tells about what that is. So sorry if I pronounced it a bit weird, but yeah, FNET.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's so either James wasn't listening properly, or he was, and his sound went a bit dodgy as Alexandra disappeared off into the Wi-Fi hell and being in a hotel room. So that's fine. I suppose there's quite a few other questions that come in, but I suppose there's one here. If you're looking forward, and it's probably the one that's literally just coming from John about this sort of when we look at suppliers and when we try to drive change through the suppliers, it's often you can have a lot of bureaucracy. You can have a lot of form filling and filling this questionnaire and filling that questionnaire and do something to take it forward. And I think a lot of smaller suppliers sometimes get swamped, can't they, with all these questions from all these organisations, but actually spend a lot of time filling the form in, but actually not doing anything about it. So I think it's maybe as a last comment here, it'd be quite good to get your thoughts about that. How do you make it easy for the suppliers to understand without having to go into form filling overload that's coming forward?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Alexandra, you.
Okay, I was just going to say, so one of the things that we've done is create I mentioned it briefly before, just the supplier assessment, but that is an assessment that works across the whole NHS. So every NHS organization, and it's done annually by a supplier. It's through a self-assessment, which is it's no cost, and it's relatively resource light. So we're really aware of this. We don't want to create form filling for form filling's sake. So I think that's how we're trying to solve that is creating one mechanism for telling us what they're doing and making that a really meaningful mechanism. So I agree. We don't want to waste people's time filling in really complex spreadsheets when actually we want them to be thinking about what they should be doing about their wider impacts.
Yeah. Sorry, Hayley, you just disappeared off again. Sorry,
I thought I turned myself off, but I turned it off and on again, or the other way around. So I have worked in initiatives that have been like this, and if you think about it, when you're talking about collectives or collaborative or cooperations, for example, in small holdings and things like that. I mean, how do you manage that, if you've got sort of like lots of smallholders working in Africa, for example, you know, you don't want them to be filling in forms all the time. So you have to take a completely different, unique approach to that. And you have to basically say, you know, we're not going to have them filling in forms because it's not going to be worth it for them or for us. It's going to stagnate the process. We're not going to get any further with that. So you need to look at other ways of addressing this. And certain, you know, in certain areas, you know, I've seen collaborations that have come together that have actually looked at, you know, a sort of like a cooperative as a group, rather than looking at each individual supplier. So you have this knowledge sharing and upskilling of supply chain in that sort of like in that cooperative, rather than looking at every single farm. You know, you basically look at what is the cooperative doing, how do you then make sure that, you know, that's managed. It's basically, it's actually very, very effective. It takes a little bit of setting up and dealing with, but we've seen some really good results of working directly with people from both a social change perspective and from an environmental perspective, using these collaborative kind of like cooperative grower kind of assessments. Things like, I don't know if anyone's aware of SIZA, SIZA, which is the South African Supply Chain Initiative. And that basically, again, the way that they look at their groups of you know, smallholders, you know, you'd never get those people to fill in forms. You wouldn't get them to do the bureaucracy around it because it's just not feasible. So you just have to apply a different model. But there are lots of models out there that we can choose from. It doesn't have to be a one size fits all.
Yeah, and I think that last point is probably the key one. But I think it's also the question is around think about it before you just go back to your normal way of, oh, well, I'll add 24 more questions to my supply qualification questions, and I'll do this because that's what I've always done. There are other approaches that's needed here too, and particularly with smaller suppliers, because often they are the innovators. They are the ones with the best ideas. They are the ones that can really help you to achieve some of these goals, but they need to that sort of encouragement to do so. So I really appreciate that. And we have run out of time. I mean, there's still quite a few questions and comments coming in. Really do thank everyone for those questions and comments as well. We haven't got to them all, which probably means that I think we've probably covered these sort of topics 2 or 3 times already on Supply Chain Talk. I'm sure we'll come back to it because it is such an important focus for all organisations. But I mean, Hayley and Alexandra, really do appreciate your time today and for answering the questions and for giving your comments. Really good insights that's come from it and stimulated a lot of debate as well. And thanks to those people who've been adding comments in chat and questions. As I said, we didn't get you to you all, and a few of you come back, but I think probably this wonderful mug needs to head on its way down to John Henderson, who I think asked lots of questions, asked lots of comments from the start, stimulated quite a bit of debate on chat as well. So thanks for that, John, and really do appreciate your time. So next week, we're going to talk about supply chain network design and the technology associated with that and how that can really make a difference. So it's really looking at, I suppose, fundamentally redesigning network supply chains and the technology associated with that and how that would really make a difference at this very uncertain time we've got. So should be a fascinating discussion next week. But at the moment, so Alexandra, Hayley, really appreciate your time today. Thank you for that. Thanks for the audience for joining in. It's been a great issue of Supply Chain Talk, and see you again next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan.